Few ideas provoke as much quiet terror and unspoken anxiety as the thought of death, because death is commonly imagined as a final annihilation, a sudden erasure of everything familiar, meaningful, and personal. Yet this image reveals more about how the mind misunderstands life than about death itself, because fear arises not from the unknown but from clinging to what is known, and the deeper the attachment to permanence, identity, and continuity, the more threatening impermanence appears, and this attachment is reinforced by the way modern culture treats death as an enemy, something to be postponed, hidden, or defeated, rather than as an integral aspect of the living process, and this framing isolates death from life, turning it into an abstract horror rather than a natural transition. Yet from a philosophical perspective inspired by Alan Watts, death is not the opposite of life, but a condition of it. Because without endings there could be no beginnings, no change, no growth, and no experience. And misunderstanding this relationship generates fear, because the mind imagines life as a possession that can be lost rather than a process that continuously transforms, and this imagination is rooted in the ego's assumption of separateness, the belief that there is a fixed self that must persist unchanged to remain meaningful. And this belief creates anxiety, because anything fixed in a changing universe is vulnerable, and death becomes the ultimate threat because it appears to dissolve the boundaries that define the self. Yet these boundaries are conceptual, constructed through memory, language, and habit, rather than intrinsic to experience, and when they dissolve, what disappears is not awareness but the story told about it. And this distinction is subtle but profound, because it reframes death not as nothingness but as the end of a particular pattern, and patterns end constantly, thoughts end, emotions end, moments end. Yet awareness remains, flowing into new forms, and recognizing this continuity reduces fear by shifting identity from form to process, and this shift aligns closely with Taoist philosophy, which views life as a cyclical movement rather than a linear trajectory with a definitive endpoint, emphasizing transformation over termination. And this cyclical view is evident in nature, where death is inseparable from renewal. As leaves fall to nourish soil, seasons change to allow growth, and organisms dissolve into the systems that sustain others. Yet humans often exempt themselves from this pattern, imagining consciousness as something outside nature rather than an expression of it, and this imagined exemption intensifies fear, because it isolates the individual from the rhythms that make death intelligible, and this isolation is reinforced by personal identity, which is constructed around continuity, the idea of being the same person over time. Yet this continuity is an illusion created by memory, because experience itself is discontinuous, changing moment by moment, and recognizing this reveals that what we call life is already a series of deaths and rebirths, the death of each moment making room for the next, and this recognition normalizes impermanence, making the finality of physical death less alien, because it is seen as an extension of an ongoing process rather than an abrupt interruption. And fear diminishes when death is contextualized within life rather than opposed to it, and this contextualization changes the relationship to time, because fear of death often manifests as anxiety about running out of time, creating urgency, regret, and a compulsive drive to maximize experience. Yet this maximization paradoxically reduces enjoyment, because it turns living into accumulation, and accumulation is driven by fear of loss, making presence difficult, and presence is what makes experience vivid. And without presence, time feels wasted regardless of how it is filled, and this insight reveals that fear of death often produces a fear of living fully, because attention is consumed by the future rather than the moment, and this consumption creates a sense of lack, because the future is always incomplete, and grounding attention in the present counters this, because in the present there is usually enough, and this sufficiency undermines the fear that something essential is missing. And this is why Alan Watts emphasized that the problem is not death, but the idea of death, the mental image constructed by the ego to defend itself against impermanence, and this image is reinforced by language, which treats death as a noun, a thing, rather than a verb, a process, making it appear static and final rather than dynamic and relational, and this linguistic framing shapes perception, making death seem like an event that happens to life rather than an aspect of life itself. And reframing death as process dissolves some of its terror, because processes are familiar, continuous, and participatory, and participation implies belonging, and belonging reduces fear, because fear thrives on isolation, and isolation is what the ego experiences when it imagines itself as separate from the world. Yet this separation is conceptual, because biologically, psychologically, and ecologically, the individual is inseparable from the environment, continuously exchanging matter, energy, and information. And death is simply the continuation of this exchange, without the particular organization we call person, and recognizing this challenges the fear of non-existence, because non-existence is a concept, not an experience, and fear of non-existence is therefore fear of an idea rather than a reality, and ideas have power only when believed, and examining them weakens their hold. And this examination reveals that what is feared is not death itself, but the loss of control, the inability to manage outcomes. And this fear is rooted in the same illusion that generates anxiety in life, the illusion of permanence and ownership. And letting go of this illusion does not remove the mystery of death, but transforms it from a threat into a natural unknown. And unknowns are not inherently frightening. They become frightening when the mind demands certainty. And releasing this demand allows curiosity to replace fear, and curiosity opens the possibility of wonder, because the unknown is also the source of novelty. And this perspective transforms mortality from a countdown to an invitation, inviting deeper engagement with life rather than avoidance. And this engagement is not frantic, but attentive, because when death is accepted as natural, there is less need to rush, and this paradoxical slowing enhances appreciation, because moments are valued for their quality rather than their quantity, and this valuation fosters gratitude, because appreciation arises naturally when impermanence is acknowledged, and gratitude is incompatible with fear, because it affirms what is present rather than mourning what will be lost, and this affirmation does not deny loss but integrates it, allowing grief without despair, and this integration is psychologically healthy because grief resisted becomes anxiety, while grief allowed becomes tenderness, and tenderness deepens connection because it recognizes shared vulnerability, and this shared vulnerability dissolves the illusion of separateness, making compassion more natural, because others are no longer seen as competitors for a limited time, but as companions in a transient process, and this companionship enriches life, because meaning is found not in duration but in relationship, and relationships